Even today, they persist. Tavis Smiley authored and published a book in 2014 entitled Death of the King, The Real Story of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Final Year. While ignoring the now extensively known facts surrounding the assassination, the television personality and host, Smiley, brings the reader up to the actual event, which is noted in the most cursory manner. There is no mention of James Earl Ray. Neither is my name or work mentioned in the text, the sources, bibliographies, or the index. Neither was I one of the people chosen to be interviewed. When asked about this omission by a colleague of my friend Jim Douglas, who has had a long-time interest in my work on this case at a Birmingham, Alabama book gathering, Smiley's comment was that he had his limits. And so he did, resulting in yet another instance of disinforming the world about the loss of this great man. It is as though my, by then, 37-year effort to bring clarity and truth to this historic event, set out in two prior books, published in 1995 and 2003, a 1989 BBC documentary, a 1993 Thames Television HBO trial, and a 30-day civil trial in 1999 where I represented the King family, had never occurred. Is it conceivable that Smiley was unfamiliar with this work and these presentations? I think not, and therein lies the insult, not only to me, but to the King family, the memory of Dr. King, and to the truth and justice as well. Coincidentally, I only knew Dr. King during the last year of his life. As David Garrow acknowledges in his book Bearing the Cross, it was my Ramparts magazine article from January 1967, The Children of Vietnam, and the photographs it contained compiled during my time as a journalist in Vietnam in 1966 that caused Dr. King to weep in my presence when I opened the file. For him, from that time forward, there was no turning away from a commitment to oppose the war. Smiley fails to mention that at Dr. King's suggestion, before introducing him to a mass crowd in front of the United Nations on April 15, 1967, it was agreed that I would put forward the idea of the King-Spock independent presidential ticket to oppose the Johnson War presidency in 1968. Smiley's selective historical account also fails to mention that with Dr. King's approval, I became the executive director of the National Conference for New Politics, NCNP, an entity that focused on developing this ticket. As a part of this effort, we mounted a large independent convention with over 5,000 delegates from all over the country, representing every peace and freedom organization of the day, convening at the Palmer House in Chicago over Labor Day weekend in 1967. Smiley did not seem to be aware, in fairness, it was only many years later that we learned the facts, that the Black Caucus that disrupted and subverted the convention was organized by the Chicago Blackstone Rangers gang, among others, who were paid and sponsored by the Johnson administration and working with Mayor Richard Daley's organization. The Johnson administration was terrified about the possibility of a King-Spock ticket and mounted a heavy anti-Israel campaign, forcing through resolutions that alienated our liberal Jewish supporters such as Martin Peretz, thus depriving the efforts of necessary funds. The administration was successful, and we did not have a clue, only learning years later what had happened. These were turbulent times. It is important to remember that some 100 cities burned that year. This was the social, political, and cultural context that dominated the atmosphere of the convention. I introduced Martin Luther King Jr. as the keynote speaker. As he was speaking, a note was passed over my shoulder. "Get him out of here as soon as he is finished, or we will take him hostage and embarrass him before the world." We had no choice. Dr. King was a unifier. Without him, the convention fell apart. Bill Coffin, the chaplain of Yale and eventually pastor of Riverside Church, a longtime social activist, and I wept. As for his final minutes in Memphis Police Department surveillance notes recorded Billy Kyles knocking on Dr. King's hotel room door at 5:50 p.m. The door opened briefly and closed. Kyles walked to the balcony and stood with his hands on the railing about 60 feet away from the door of the room from which Dr. King exited. Kyles did not go down to get a car. Neither did he approach Dr. King, who was standing alone on the balcony. For years, this uncharacteristic action by Kyles puzzled me. That is no longer the case. Dr. King came out from the room around 6 p.m., Ralph Abernathy was still inside. Dr. King was shot about 4 minutes later. Tavis Smiley is the latest in a long list of authors and publishers to recount the time of the assassination itself. He, among others, have produced books and articles that have served to provide credibility to the official or establishment account of this seminal American historical event. For a complete summary analysis, listen to the epilogue. It matters little that Smiley's latest work not only ignores the event itself, but that his work is critically characterized by significant omissions. It is incredibly revealing that Smiley never reached out to interview me, but I suppose that the reason is obvious. He had his limits. They might have been breached. At this writing, I understand that the Discovery Channel will be airing a documentary. I have not been interviewed recently for this production. We will see if they also had their limits.